Mark DeRosa has been around baseball his entire life. As a player, he spent 16 seasons in the major leagues, competing against the best pitchers of his generation, standing in against arms that defined eras. As an analyst, he has spent years breaking down the sport with the kind of credibility that only comes from having actually lived inside it. He is not someone who changes his mind easily. He is not someone who reaches for dramatic language when measured language will do. So when Mark DeRosa sat down in front of the camera after watching Shohei Ohtani pitch and said, quietly, almost to himself, "I never knew Shohei was a pitching monster," the baseball world stopped and paid attention. Not because the performance was surprising to everyone, but because of who was saying it. DeRosa had been skeptical. Not quietly skeptical, not privately skeptical, but publicly, on record, stated for the cameras skeptical. He had questioned whether Ohtani's pitching, removed from the novelty of the two-way narrative, truly belonged in the conversation with the elite starting pitchers in the game. He had suggested, more than once, that the fascination with Ohtani as a pitcher was inseparable from the fascination with Ohtani as a phenomenon, and that if you stripped away the home runs and the cultural story and the unprecedented nature of what he was doing, the pitching alone might not hold up to the scrutiny it was receiving. He believed that. He said it out loud. He defended it when challenged. And then he watched Ohtani pitch. And everything changed. This was not a casual opinion. This was not the kind of take that an analyst throws out to generate conversation and quietly abandons when the pushback arrives. DeRosa had constructed a genuine argument, built on real baseball logic, and he had stood behind it with the confidence of someone who had played the game at the highest level and trusted his own judgment. His core position was this. Ohtani's pitching statistics, while impressive, needed to be contextualized. The innings totals were lower than a traditional starter's. The workload was managed carefully, more carefully than the workload of a pure pitcher competing for a Cy Young award. The narrative surrounding him was so powerful, so all-consuming, that it was almost impossible for anyone, fans, analysts, even players, to evaluate his pitching separately from everything else he represented. DeRosa argued that the two-way story was doing work that the pitching alone might not be able to do on its own. That Ohtani the pitcher, separated from Ohtani the phenomenon, was an excellent major league starter, but perhaps not the generational pitching talent that the coverage suggested. He made this argument carefully. He backed it with data. He acknowledged Ohtani's talent while questioning the scale of the evaluation. It was a reasonable position. It was a defensible position. And it was a position that the afternoon's pitching performance systematically and completely destroyed. There is no theatrical entrance. No visible adjustment in demeanor from the warm-up to the first pitch. Ohtani walks to the mound, takes his sign, and goes to work. The transition from preparation to competition is seamless, which is itself a form of mastery that gets underreported in coverage that focuses primarily on results. DeRosa was watching from the broadcast booth. He had his notes. He had his prepared observations. He had, presumably, his prior position somewhere in the back of his mind, the argument he had made publicly, the skepticism he had expressed, the questions he had raised about whether the pitching alone was truly as exceptional as the coverage suggested. The first inning did not answer those questions definitively. First innings rarely do. Ohtani retired the side efficiently, but efficiency in the first inning is expected from a pitcher of his caliber. DeRosa noted the velocity, noted the movement, and continued watching. The second inning was where the first signal arrived. Ohtani faced the heart of the opposing lineup, the 3, 4, and 5 hitters, the experienced major league bats who had been briefed on his tendencies and came to the plate with a plan. And he took that plan apart. Not with overwhelming velocity alone, not with one signature pitch that he leaned on repeatedly, but with sequencing. With the kind of pitch-to-pitch intelligence that forces hitters to constantly update their expectations and constantly arrive at the wrong answer. In the booth, DeRosa leaned forward slightly. This is the thing about watching a truly elite pitcher perform in real time. The adjustment happens before you consciously decide to make it. The evidence accumulates pitch by pitch, out by out, inning by inning, and at some point the gap between what you expected and what you are seeing becomes too large to bridge with the framework you brought into the game. DeRosa had brought a framework. A skeptical one. A carefully constructed one. And the fourth inning was where that framework began to crack. Ohtani struck out the side in the fourth. Not with 3 fastballs. Not by overpowering hitters with the same pitch in the same location. He struck out 3 professional hitters using 3 completely different sequences, exploiting 3 completely different weaknesses, demonstrating 3 completely different aspects of a pitching arsenal that was, in that moment, operating without a visible limitation. The first strikeout came on a sweeper that started over the inner half of the plate and broke sharply away, catching the hitter completely wrong-footed on a pitch he had been sitting on. The second came on a fastball up in the zone, the opposite location, the opposite pitch type, a decision that only makes sense if the pitcher fully understands what the hitter is thinking after watching the first at-bat in that inning. The third came on a splitter in the dirt, a pitch so well executed that the hitter's swing was already committed before the ball finished its drop. 3 pitches. 3 strikeouts. 3 decisions that required not just physical ability but genuine, real-time, in-game intelligence operating at a level that is genuinely rare at any level of professional baseball. In the booth, DeRosa went quiet for a moment. Then he said something that his producer would later describe as the moment the broadcast changed. He said, "I'm watching something I didn't expect to watch today." Because the fourth inning could still be explained, at least partially, by circumstance. A good stretch. A moment when everything is working. Every elite pitcher has innings like that, stretches where the stuff is sharp and the command is on and the sequencing is clicking, and the results look almost too clean to be sustainable. But the 5th and 6th innings were not a stretch of circumstance. They were a continuation of something systematic. Ohtani was not just pitching well in moments. He was maintaining a standard across innings, across different hitters, across different counts, across the natural adjustments that opposing lineups make as they see a pitcher for the second and third time through the order. The second time through the order is where good pitchers get exposed. It is where hitters start to catch up, where the element of unfamiliarity that helped early in the game begins to fade, where the pitcher's tendencies become readable and the lineup begins to exploit them. This is one of the central challenges of starting pitching at the major league level, and it is one of the primary reasons why pitch counts and innings limits exist, because the second time through the order is where the equation changes. Ohtani did not let the equation change. He adjusted before the hitters could adjust. He reached back for velocity when he needed it and pulled back when pulling back was smarter. He went to his splitter in counts where hitters were sitting on his sweeper. He threw his fastball in locations that made no sense until you understood the at-bat he was building, and then they made complete sense. By the time the 6th inning ended, the strikeout total had climbed to a number that made the booth go slightly electric. Not because of the number itself, but because of how those strikeouts had been earned. Not one of them felt like a mistake by the hitter. Every one of them felt like a decision by the pitcher. DeRosa put down his notes. This is the part that the highlight clip does not capture. The moment between the performance ending and the analyst finding the words. Because finding the right words after watching something that genuinely recalibrates your understanding is not immediate. It takes a moment. It requires honesty about what you saw and honesty about what you said before you saw it. DeRosa has built a career on that kind of honesty. It is what makes him credible. It is what separates him from analysts who protect their prior positions regardless of what the evidence says. He has always been willing to follow the evidence wherever it leads, even when it leads somewhere uncomfortable. And what the evidence had just told him, across 6 innings of watching Ohtani pitch, was uncomfortable in the best possible way. It told him that his framework had been wrong. Not slightly miscalibrated. Not partially incomplete. Wrong. He looked into the camera and said it directly. I never knew Shohei was a pitching monster. Because DeRosa is precise with language. When he said he never knew, he was not saying he had ignored the evidence. He was saying that the evidence he had previously engaged with, the statistics, the highlight clips, the broadcast footage, the scouting reports and analytical breakdowns, had not prepared him for what it actually felt like to watch Ohtani pitch at this level in real time. This is a distinction that matters. There is a difference between knowing something intellectually and understanding it experientially. DeRosa had known, intellectually, that Ohtani's numbers were excellent. He had processed that information and still arrived at his skeptical position, because he believed the context surrounding those numbers was inflating how they were being received. What he had not done, apparently, was sit down and watch Ohtani pitch from beginning to end, inning by inning, pitch by pitch, with the full attention that a broadcast analyst brings to a performance they are responsible for describing to an audience. When he finally did that, when he watched the whole thing, without the filter of the two-way narrative, without the cultural story getting in the way, just the pitching, he arrived somewhere completely different from where he had been. Monster was the word he reached for. And once he said it, he did not walk it back. He did not qualify it or hedge it or soften it with the kind of analytical caution that sometimes makes broadcast commentary feel less honest than it should. He said it and he meant it and he let it stand. Because DeRosa is not alone in the journey his opinion took. There is a version of his story, the careful skepticism, the reasoned doubt, the questioning of whether the narrative was doing work the performance couldn't do on its own, that lives in a lot of baseball minds. In broadcast booths and front offices and dugouts across the league, there are people who have held some version of the position DeRosa held publicly. Some of them have already had their DeRosa moment. Their afternoon of watching Ohtani pitch and arriving somewhere they did not expect to arrive. Their moment of sitting quietly after the final out and finding that the framework they brought into the game no longer fit what they had just seen. Others are still waiting for that moment. Still holding their carefully constructed skepticism. Still believing that the narrative is doing work the performance cannot do alone. What DeRosa's afternoon tells them is simple. Watch the whole thing. Not the highlights. Not the clips. Not the statistical summary. The whole thing, from the first pitch to the last out, with the full attention it deserves. And then decide. Because 6 innings of watching Shohei Ohtani pitch at his best has a way of making decisions very easy. DeRosa found that out. The hard way. The honest way. And he said so out loud, which is the only way that kind of honesty ever really counts.